Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming to the Montana Book Festival. Thank you for coming to this panel. My name is Mara Panich. I am the poetry editor for Awaken the World Volume 3. I was just saying I need to have about 5 badges because I'm also the owner of Fact and Fiction Books, who's the official bookseller of the festival, and the introducer for this panel. So I want to welcome Chris Latre, current Poet Laureate of Montana, who is also included in the Awaken the World Volume 3, and he's also in Volume 1 and 2. And Mark, are you in all 3, or?
I have no idea. I'm in the last one. The second one.
The second one. I know you're in 2 and 3.
Yeah.
This is Mark Gibbons, the former Poet Laureate of Montana. This all just happened like a month ago, thereabouts. 2 weeks ago, so.
We should get a congratulatory shake hand picture.
Yes. Thanks for all the emails.
And I'm going to stand in between. So we are here to talk about the Awaken the World Volume 3 anthology, which, as I said, I was the poetry editor for. I was kind of surprised when I got asked to be the poetry editor for this anthology, because though I am a poet, I would not necessarily call myself a nature poet. And I don't think anybody would naturally put me in that category. But when I talked to Daniel from River Feet Press about it, he was adamant that I was who he wanted to do it, and that he wanted somebody who might have a different perspective on the nature poem, that it wasn't just mountains and rivers and fish.
He also knew you were the only one who could sell a pile of them.
That's true. That I'd naturally stock a bunch of them in my store. So anyway, that's one thing that I'm very proud of the poetry section in this. I think it's more unusual than most nature poem collections, though there are some more standards, and then there's also some very different things.
Can we already ask questions? Because how does that work? How do you? It's like when you say you're the poetry editor. What's the process for people submitting, and then what do you have to do, and how much of a pain in the ass was it?
Pain in the ass scale 0 to Chris Latre?
Yes.
Okay. So this, there's a bright projector there. The process, it was put up on Submittable, which is a submissions platform, started and run here in Missoula, but handles things from all over the world, actually. And so it's put out there that this anthology is open for submissions, and here are the guidelines of what we're looking for. So, if you send in a poetry that has absolutely nothing to do with Awaken the World, about wildlife, adventure, and the environment, then, you're automatically excluded. But people from all over can enter their poems, and they put them in there, and then as they come in, preferably, but often at the last minute, you read through them, and you organize, and, there's ways of rating things to kind of help you organize. I'd say it's kind of like a 6 on the PIA scale. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of going back and forth and rereading things and deciding and seeing how well things fit. Some things, you read it immediately, and it's like, that's in. Other things, you read it immediately and say, no. But then that big chunk in the middle becomes you can only select so much. You can't make the anthology. I think I had over 100 submissions to go through. So, and they all a lot of them submitted multiple poems. So it was,
Were they blind submissions?
This was not blind submissions, although I tried my best to read them blind because I did know a good chunk of people, although the chunk of people I knew mostly would have gotten it in anyway, because they're all accomplished poets. Yeah. And I looked a lot for originality and something different.
And it's subjective in the end, isn't it? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
It's gotta be, right?
Yeah.
Gotta make a choice.
Before
Somebody else.
coffee, after
Then
coffee.
you can be in the next one if you didn't make this one. Or another one.
Yeah. So I think what we were going to do was we were each going to read a selection, either, well, our own poem from the book, and then possibly some others. I'm going to, if you want, I can start,
Sure.
since I'm already talking. But I'm going to read my selection that because we also put our own, as the editors, we put our own. I should explain, there's 3 sections, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in here. Unfortunately, the fiction and nonfiction editors live far away, so they weren't able to be here for this. But we all also contributed a piece to the book. And the one I contributed is titled Mud. Dirty, wet hubris, growing warm with thaw and reaching, crowded letters from words of expression eaten by awakened worms. When you told me that birth is magical and ugly, I imagined the expelling of all the undergrowth in spring, where slop precedes beauty, smelling of the rot that feeds life. Your giving comes from the damp places between legs, where existence begins in pleasure and pain. What breed is this emotive birthing, one born of sunlight wakening, or a mushroom's surprise at the richness obtained when our egos thrive in the decay of darkness? Fight guilt with confusion, tell each rhythm that it is unworthy of appreciation, because seriousness is equal to sadness, but this happy, well-wishing inspiration feels so energetic on my tongue. We also did within the submissions process, we chose a best of our submissions, and the best of the submissions had an opportunity to get a full manuscript reviewed by Riverfeet Press and possibly published. And the one that I chose was a poet named Irene Cooper. And I really liked the way she played with words, and like I said, it's different. It's a longer poem. Hopefully I do it justice, but I figured I could share that with you also, since we don't have a huge group of folks in this anthology here. This one is titled Drift. 1, confluence divergence. Hydraulic sponge of volcanic bedrock feeds the river of falls, which joins the Crooked and Multulus at Billy Chinook. Reservoir is French for keep, Old English for hold, but nothing holds. Under our slow eye, rock yawns and stretches at our feet. In geologic terms, it's only a minute or so since lava flowed and cooled to form the porous basin that seizes and draws the rain from runoff. Watery keep sinks, circulates, emerging months and years ahead as spring, unless it doesn't. Wychus Creek, old steelhead paradise, saw none nor no Chinook for 50 years and more. Peculiar web of waterways and stable, diverted to dry and dire straits. What if there was yoga for rivers and a sauna to raise the winter flow from its score of cubic feet per second? Gentle, the summer floods raise all boats and restore the nimble reaches to their hardy oddities. 2, basin nature. Jay bathes in a sprinkler-puddled swing. Lawnmower stirs a doe to lift her gaze. Coyote cruises Deschutes River woods at noon. At twilight, bucks leap like skater boys on Colorado. Black bear paws Tumalo Creek. Mooney raccoon wakes the chickens, riles the dogs. Vixen skitters her red kits along Highway 97. Sudden owl swoops before the headlights. bobcat skims the dusty rim rock, sights us, surprises us on our careful trails. 3, greater sage grouse. They numbered 16 million 50 years ago or so, and today the rough count's 500,000, plenty to grouse about for the living 3%, plus uncrushed species that swim the sagebrush sea. Pygmy rabbits, pronghorn, golden eagles, coyote, yellow bells, milk vetch, tarweed, fiddleneck, 350 entities native to the brush. A lek is the place male grouse display their moves, spike the air with punk fans of tail feathers, puff their masculine air sacs, gloop, gloop. Sage chickens mating on the sage steppe, losing ground and cover fast to fire, juniper creep people in Oregon, at least, the ranchers are on board. Save the bird, save the herd. Across state lines, nothing rhymes with gas, with oil. But back to sex, the choreography commences at golden dawn, competitive and feathered as any rodeo. Many are called to the ancient do-si-do, few get to do the deed. Lonely males await their season in a patch of scrub. Females get busy with the babies. The grouse is not endangered, per se, but we watch, this bellwether, this indicator, we watch, tick-tock, the canary as it dances in the coal mine. I'm actually going to just leave it at that and let you gentlemen read, but you can get the book. I can. There is a lovely bio before each poem. She is the author of Committal, a poet-friendly spy-fi about family, and a poetry collection, Spare Change, which was from Finishing Line Press, and trying to find out. She teaches in community and supports AIC-directed creative writing opportunities at a regional prison. She lives in Oregon with her people, Maggie the Corgi, and Maggie the Corgi, where she pretends to garden but mostly watches the birds. But it looks like a, Oregon writer. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. You guys want to read something?
I'm going to read Todd Davis's poem
Nice.
first.
Nice.
You know, he's in town, but he's fishing.
Is he in town right now?
He's in town as we speak.
But he's fishing and not.
Yeah.
So I'm reading Todd for a couple reasons. One, I didn't know he was in town. I just got the most beautiful card in the mail from him yesterday, and that's been one of the great things about being named Poet Laureate is all the contacts I've gotten from people that I don't hear from that much. And he just sent me the most beautiful, thoughtful card. I could have brought that and read it as a poem because he's a fantastic poet. But Todd is a guy that I've known about a decade. And, normally the rule is you don't tell stories about the poems you're about to read. This is a separate story. It's not about the poem, so I'm not breaking that rule. But about a decade ago, when Jim Harrison's Dead Man's Float came out, when he was still alive, it was his last published book of poetry before he passed away. I wrote a review of it for the Missoula Independent, I think. And word got around, and I get this email from this guy named Todd Davis. And he's like, I really enjoyed your Jim Harrison poem. Harrison had blurbed one of his books, and I'm reading his background. And I'm like, he goes, would you be interested maybe in reviewing one of my books? And Mark and I get together for beers, and I'm like, this guy is like a real poet. What do I know about his? And Mark said, well, that just goes to show how starved for attention poets are. and over the years, we just became really good friends. He was at the Beargrass retreat where I think we met Daniel, and which, before there was an Awaken the World 1, before there was a one-sentence journal, all of this stuff. So Todd is one of these kind of icons in my life that has been there from the very beginning of kind of the life that I'm living now. And he's just a wonderful man, and I call him the high priest of Pennsylvania poetry. And by priest, I mean like a druid priest, because you could totally picture him out in the woods in a hide robe and a staff and just, doing druid stuff. But this, antlers, yeah. It's called Lost Blue. For more than a decade, I stole snowmelt from spring, lifted pink and red bodies twisting from current, the only fish born rightfully to this place. But after the fire ran up the mountain, root balls incinerated, a scorched absence large enough to crawl inside of, the stream holds only ash, water warmed without banked dogwood and willow, the leaky canoes of fir and spruce sunk to the bottom. I count every fish as it swims away to the main river, orphans of the lost blue I'd hoped to show my son before the debt of loving a place broke him. Isn't that, I cry all the time, so that's not a big surprise. But his work regularly moves me to tears, and I think that's a perfect example of one. Todd Davis, High Priest of Pennsylvania Poetry. Mark, would you like to read one while I gather myself again?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't prepare something that somebody else had read in here. Maybe I should try to read Jillian's. Jillian Kessler is a poet. A couple of years ago, I kind of took over the realm of being like a poetry editor for Foothills Publishing, and these two people were included in that first series of poetry that I edited, as was Jillian Kessler. And page 83.
Are you doing that again? I heard that you were editing another series.
I am.
Okay.
Well, sort of. You know how that goes. Slow but steady. Yeah, right now we're in the midst of doing another 6 poets. And interestingly enough, this go around, because the time that we did it, and you guys were in it, almost like 4 out of 6 were from Missoula, the poets. And everybody was like, Montana poets? And so this time, everybody is from outside of Missoula, so that's kind of cool. But anyway, this is Jillian Kessler's poem. Jillian is a teacher over at the International School here in Missoula, and many of you probably know Jillian. I was not planning on doing this, so forgive me if I stumble somewhere along the line. Suspended somewhere animal. The river rising, an orange dog runs through the makeshift marsh after a young mallard. I enter my body of wild chives and white lilacs, taste buds purified, drums blown blue with flax, sweet grass, forgiveness that's not accusatory. Her echo heavy in an upturned palm. The creek could be rowed, daughter heron in a gold velvet hat, son sage grouse, fast and close to the earth. Husband, not bird at all, but something like the trees, the surety of seasons. Do you have your compass? Do you wear it locked around your neck? The monsters have settled, the screen is shut, we're in real life. There is nothing and everything under the bed. I can't keep up with wildflowers. We buried Solomon's placenta beneath the cherry tree, defrosted poppy in a metal bowl, guarded mussel in my hands. There were no thoughts of transmission then, the masked vibrations of fear. We held one another beneath this branch of starlight. Bloom girls in heavy thicket, curls meld, heads still, held in aspen's silent shudder. They grow into families. They breathe in the expanse of open space, thawing earth, and out of mist they rise, the way wood smoke rises, then disappears. Jillian Kessler. Pardon me, my lips are sticking together. I'm going to read the one that I have in here. I'm just going to read it out here because the print's a little bit bigger, which obviously is challenging. And thank you, Mara, for including this poem. I too don't exactly consider myself a nature poet. I don't know what the hell a poet is. And poets are poets, and they write about everything usually. But I do remember I read something that William Stafford wrote about how he wrote, and he just kind of said he showed up and waited for something to happen, and when something arrived that was worthy, and he didn't wait too long, he jumped on it and started chronicling that, and as he said, one thing led to another, as one trade leads to another, and all of a sudden he had a poem, and it was full of stuff that he never ever expected to write. And I love that definition of what it is to write a poem. Any of you that write poems, I think, are on the same page with that whole kind of an experience, probably. And so anyway, this poem is what it is. It started on a mountaintop, so it's a nature poem. It's called Clue, Clue. Hell, I can't even read the first word. It's called Cool Blue Dawn. Bring me to the top of the mountain, at the top of the world, this dawn top of the morning, to stand in the eagle's lair, the air, wind cool, steady, whipping my hair, blue sky far as eye can see. Just me on this rock, feathers ruffled, turning blue till you arrive, and that makes two, three birds to share this view. Bring me the backyard bluebird, let it sing harmony with the finch in the hedge, dance with the chickadee hopping the spruce trunk, open for the meadowlark's heartbreaking solo of hope hidden in weeds. Let miles scream a bitchy hawk whistle, make bird squawk camp robber riffs, have monk crow and whippoorwill the only way to go home, beg Coltrane to blow coda of mourning doves supreme. Bring me the music of birds today. Those are the best words of comfort for the feeling of soul. Help us learn the language we don't know. This world, this life we love, this light and noise we agree exists. What we see and don't understand. Help us forget the threat we constantly fear, knowing we are going to disappear. For some reason, it terrifies us to be as fragile and beautiful as birds. Bring me the dream of wings, of freedom aloft, that promise of flight when fate closes and opens the door into birdsong and joy. Fearless in the new dawn, breaking over the unknown. Hearts reborn in a new kind of blue.
I love listening to you read, Mark.
Thank you. So that was my contribution to Awaken the World. And are we going to split this up? Are we going to ping pong it, or shall I read a couple more and then throw it back to somebody else? Or what do you want to do?
I'm sorry?
Chris needs to read his poem.
Well, I
There
want to
you go.
talk about what you were saying there about, and what you were saying also.
You just like to talk.
I do like to talk. Yes.
Go ahead.
So two things. First, the idea of like, what's a nature poem? And that's one of those things that, what isn't? What isn't nature? We're in nature right now, whether it's just our human-created nature or somewhere out on the mountain. And somehow, somewhere, we decided the only thing that was wild in nature was something that was generally inaccessible to most people. And I think of like one time years ago, Mara, if you remember this, we'd spent the day at the bookstore, and we were walking over to the Rhino for a little pick-me-up before doing an event that night. And we came down the corner in the alley, and here's this Cooper's hawk with a rock pigeon right at it. And it was looking at us like, don't even come at me.
This my lunch.
Yes, and that was as wild in that alley as it would have been if we were somewhere on a mountaintop in Glacier, you know, and just that connection that I hope you see it in conservation, that conversation is changing a little bit. And just the observation that you know, the Stafford thing about just kind of letting the world come to you, and then you immediately, whatever that is, you get it down on paper, and then you work from there, which is the whole reason I'm here. It was a practice of deciding that at some point in my life, I needed to make an observation and write just one freaking sentence about it, and then hopefully that would become something else. And that practice is literally why I'm here. And David, my friend David here, invited me recently to submit some short poems for a class he's teaching on letterpress. You know, the old school machine, hand type, broadside things. And this poem, this sentence that I have since turned into a poem, I'm going to dedicate to you, because that is exactly what I thought of when you asked me that, was this particular poem. There was a moment of observation that I've come to love very much. Untitled. Almost lost in the cacophony of the other morning birds, the doves keep up their steady, rhythmic cooing like tiny monks chanting their way to paradise. Won't that look beautiful on a broadside?
Well,
Tiny monks chanting their way to paradise. You don't attain that level of genius addicted to Netflix. I can say stuff like that now. 3 weeks ago, I would not have dreamed to say such things, but my ego is out for the world now. Here's my contribution to Awaken the World 3. The Eternal River. A surging tide, a tsunami, a rogue wave overturning all vessels. A trickle of spring creeping out from under a mass of duff deep in the forest. Landslide of rock, a calving overhang of snow broken loose by sunlight. The tiniest stone rolled loose by the vibrating rumble of a passing freight train. The great is separated from the tiny by the narrowest margin of perceived scale. What is the avalanche to those who only read about it? While the roadside stone may be the instrument of their ankle rolling, driving a foot, club-like, into a boot to be dragged along for weeks, or even the instigator of days bedridden, perhaps. Each is an opportunity for awe, a catalyst to pause, to take notice. The tsunami has its moment, lodges itself in memory to be honored by anniversary, while the unnoticed spring becomes a creek, then tributary, and finally, the eternal river. That's by Chris Latreille. Métis storyteller, descendant of the Pembina band of the mighty Red River of the North, and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. Thank you.
I had something on my feeble mind right at that, and it'll come back to me, so you just keep going. Talk amongst yourselves.
Does anybody else have any questions for
Yeah.
us?
love to.
Well, I know what I was going to say
Chatter.
briefly while you're thinking of that question, is that is one of the things that the honor of being, noted, okay, you're the guy that's on tab, or the woman, whatever the case may be, as poet laureate of the state. It just gives you the opportunity to talk more about whatever that is or what poetry is, because most of us that have, like us, that have written poetry and done a lot of other things to survive, didn't get a lot of opportunity to talk about poetry. David, and I mean, actually what we taught in the schools, I've taught little kids poetry, and that's, I talk about poetry with them, but I'm talking about adults. In the adult world of my life, nobody gives a shit about poetry. In the jobs that I had. But to be in a university setting, of course, you get to do that all the time, right? I mean, it's part of your job. But in this little time frame of the 2 years that you have, you're going to get a chance to be talking about poetry all the time in ways that, I thought it was wonderful. I enjoyed it. Yeah, and you didn't get that I didn't get that opportunity before, really. So
So far, I've had a great chance to write just a shit ton of emails. like my whole poetry practice has become email writing. You know, did you have that?
Maybe, yeah, probably at the beginning, but not that much. You know, part of it was the pandemic too, played a big hand, I think, and we're still kind of coming out of that, I think. But we're almost back to normal. We're getting there, I think. But it was kind of quiet for a while when I first took over, and I think that Melissa and Mandy both suffered from the same thing on the front end of that pandemic.
I got a question for Chris, two questions. Talk a little bit about your one sentence process. Does it just allow you as perfect? Does it allow you to rework it, sit with it, come back to it? And also, how might that lead to a longer piece of the book?
Sometimes, if I get in a good routine of it, it's pretty easy. Because then that means I'm doing a better job of just paying attention throughout the day and doing a better job of, like, when something strikes, writing it down right then. So whether it's in my, you know, this is the vehicle for most of them. It's just this little field notes that I carry all the time. But this becomes the vehicle. So it's easy as long, it's like lifting weights. If you do it every day, they're easier than if you go a week and you're like, oh, holy shit, you know? So when they make the original sentence, they're pretty much how they were right off the brain. But then when I decide that I'm going to turn some of them into poems, I'll go back, and even then I might tweak them a little bit. And for longer works, like I have a piece in the upcoming Cut Bank magazine that, so our friend, mutual friend, which one? I had his name and now it's gone.
Give me
Something to do with Cut Bank.
Yeah,
Starts
so
with-
he was up in Sealy for 30 years, 20 years, for the writing collaborative. Robert Lee.
Robert Lee,
Jesus.
oh.
Don't tell Robert. Robert did this thing where he was teaching in Alaska and he had all of his kids write these I am made of poems where you just reflected on part of your life. And I did like a little tribute to that in One Sentence Journal that began as a sentence I am made of. And I talked about the cold in my room that I grew up in and all of that. So I'm made of just growing up in the cold. And that was one short poem. And then I would have my students for the writing collaborative do I am made of poems. And I would sometimes do them along with them. And so this piece that's in Cut Bank that's coming out is a series of 3 or 4 of those one I am made of poems that I came up with just to write along with the kids, combined into one longer piece. So that's kind of how they can create longer pieces as well. But then it's almost, you know, they started out as almost haiku without me knowing it. So when you read haiku, you can throw 1 on a page or 2 on a page, and it becomes kind of a trip, especially like through the season. So you have multiple little pieces that are exploring this season, and that's how I set One Sentence Journal up too, was seasonal poems. And that was by accident, not knowing that that's how the Japanese poets did it too. So there's all these little pieces of tradition and inspiration and tweaking and not tweaking that comprise putting it all together into one.
It sounds like the daily practice is like an important thing to keep writing.
I feel like a daily practice, and it's not for everybody, but for me, a daily practice. You know, Mara and I wrote together for a year where we would take a prompt when we worked together at the bookstore, we would take a prompt and then we would write to it for 10 minutes. And she filled, 4 or 5 big
4 or
journals?
5 journals.
And I
Yeah.
filled 14 of these.
Yeah.
Just in the course of writing 10 minutes a day, we didn't miss a day. Even days we didn't work together, we would get on the
We would
text
literally
and
text
say,
each other,
okay,
yeah.
are you ready? Give me 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we would say, okay, start. And then we would do it. And that, even though a lot of that's garbage, you know, half the poems that I have that I read regularly right now are from that period. Mm-hmm. A daily practice is just essential for me. What's yours? You've been writing poetry a long time.
Well, I think you do it in your head.
Yeah?
I mean, poetry isn't, you've said this, that poetry is an extension of thinking, and so that means everybody's a poet. Not everybody writes it down on paper, but I don't, no, I don't practice, I don't have a regular time and place. It's just, I get around to it
Yeah.
fairly often, and if I don't get around to it, it gets around to me, and everybody else around me lets me know that something's wrong, yeah. So I need to write, and that's just a good thing to do. I mean, it's just a good way to process the world for me, and it's a good way to play, and there's something about it. It's just addictive. The more you do it, the more you want to do it. So it's like anything that you like to do. The more you do it, the more you like to do it.
Yes.
So I'm curious, so we've got Mara, I mean, you are literally in the business of poetry and literature in Montana, flanked by two laureates, which, Montana's not really that old of a thing in the big picture. And I'm curious, from being people who do words in and around and about Montana, I'd be curious what each of you think Montana is. I mean, beyond the obvious,
I'll put on my angry Indian hat and say there's been poetry recited here for hundreds and millennia of years. So what we're doing is nothing new, it's just different. And that's one of the things that I teach the kids on the reservation when I go up there. It's like, you don't have to write this stuff. The least thing I care about is what's on the page. It's the discussions we have, and it's the connecting to your traditions and your family and your people and the world around you, and what that does when it gets inside you and rummages everything up, and then how you approach your life from that point forward. If that involves something ending up on a page, great. We need more young indigenous poets. But at the same time, if it just changes how you live in the world, which I think poetry is, I think poetry is the connection I make is in Anishinaabe spirituality. To live an Anishinaabe life means every footstep becomes a prayer. So I relate that to my kids, that if you live a life of poetry, if you're paying attention and you're letting it filter through your body, then every footstep becomes a poem. And that is the perspective that I want people to come away from their time with me with, is the idea that it's a way of living in the world, and if it ends up on the page, fantastic. But it's more about those footsteps. That's my answers.
I don't think that my definition of Montana really affects the poetry. Montana, I mean, I love my community and I love the state I live in and the area we live in and this beautiful things that surround me. There's also a lot of ugly politics and things like that that are a part of it. But like Montana itself as an ideology that affects my poetry is not really there. It's more just a social construct that we have to like live in that box of this is where we are. And like, I do think that sometimes from different places, and it fits right in with the idea of like, are you a nature poet? Are you a this poet? Are you a that? All three of us are Montana poets because we live in Montana and we write about where we live and whether, we're writing about horses and prairie or the reservation or, working in a mill or whatever. It's because this is where we live and what we experience, what those things we collect, as you were saying about Stafford, throughout time as we collect them. But I don't think the idea of Montana itself or the age of Montana as a state has much to do with it, as much as one might think. It's kind of like genre has very little to do with what you write as a writer. You may lean towards a genre, but most writers I know don't go in, like you said, you don't go in, I'm gonna write this poem and it's gonna look exactly like this. novelists, nonfiction writers, often they have an idea of what they're going for, but it doesn't dictate everything. And I think that's kind of my best answer to that, is that it's a part of it, but it's
no different than those prompts we used to challenge ourselves with.
yeah.
I mean, we can say, I'm going to write a Montana poem, and
Actually, in volume 2, there's my literally how to write a Montana poem because of a discussion of that question.
yeah, and most of the time we would have this prompt, and it'd be like, neither one of us would write anything near to the prompt. There might have been one word or one idea related to it that triggered something else, or we'd already begun the day thinking of something that came out on the page, but the prompt itself was more the vehicle for just getting the pen going, whether it was related to it or not.
Yeah, and I don't, my response is, it's an individual response, right? Because, I mean, what is a Montana poem to me? Since I've lived here all of my entire life, and now I've been around for a few days, it's my understanding of what that is, and it's constantly changing, because as we know, once we've been around for a few days, we've changed. Everything has changed. Everything's constantly changing. And part of it is like Chris was talking about, you know, his heritage, the tradition of the indigenous people that were here before settlers or white people ever showed up. I came here as a result of a group of people that came from another continent, right? And so I was just visiting recently with Terry O'Riordan, who runs the Irish Studies program at the University of Montana. And he was talking about, you know, how he's going to be buried in Ireland because his bones need to go in the ground there, because that's his home. That's where he's from. That's in him. He's a part of that place, and that place is a part of him. And I thought, that's interesting, because I've made that same statement about Montana. Why? I don't know why. It's just, I feel like I belong in this place, and I should die here, and I will. Nobody's going to take me out of here without a lot of kicking and screaming. That's just, and I don't know why. I really don't understand why. It has a lot to do with all of the beauty and the fish and the elk and the deer and the bear and all that crazy environmental wildy shit. But it also has to do with just being here that long and calling this place home for some reason. It's inside me, and I don't know how to get away from it or have it get away from me. So as a result of that, everything that I write is going to be Montana for me. But what the hell does that mean to anybody else that writes in Montana? Everybody's got their own story and their own relationship to a place. And that's my relationship to the place, like Chris and like Mara. And we're all different. But
We used to talking about the heritage thing of where you're originally from. You know, Mara's ancestors are from Serbia, right? Mm-hmm. And I used to make the joke that when Mara talks about going to the old country, she talks about going to Serbia. I talk about going to Great Falls. Though that's an exaggeration. I actually get to go all the way to North Dakota. But yeah, it's just perspective.
Yeah. And I think no matter where you are, that affects your sense of place. And I mean, I've been here a long time. I've almost lived here longer than I have anywhere else, and it is home to me, and I'm a part of this place, and I get that. I'm not trying to say that's not a thing, because it is, but I don't know. You absorb things everywhere you go. Mm-hmm. And especially if you're there for a significant amount of time, and every place follows you, every experience follows you wherever you go. And the longer you stay somewhere, perhaps that just means the longer it gets inside of you and becomes a part of your cellular makeup. possibly even actually as you're
Yeah, I
saying,
mean,
make up with the exchange of.
If there is such a thing as regional poetry, it's just
Yeah.
because these people were living in this place at this time, and that's what
Yeah.
they wrote, you know? I mean, so that's
Yeah.
regional poetry. I don't know what that means really, but, other than just that, it was a time and place that these people wrote.
Yeah, because what we're saying about Montana, you could say about Ohio or
Yeah.
or Florida or any place, any
Yeah.
place.
Anybody else?
How long do we have
I
to?
don't know if we're supposed to go till 3:15 or 3.
How long do we have to be so
Are we-
magnificently entertaining?
You're on the schedule till 3:30.
Okay.
Oh, my.
We got plenty of time then.
Better read
gotta-
another one.
Okay. Any other questions?
Oh,
And I don't know about Mara and Mark, so, I mean, they can answer this question. I'm just really curious, what made the transition from prose to poetry? Because I will have to say, it really surprises me when I say, yeah, you're a poet, because you started out prose. And when did you, and I don't even know if it's the proper word to say, why did you make that transition? Was it just natural? And, you know, and Mark, too, I don't know how they started out in their writing, if they started out in prose, or I've always been poets.
Well, I've been writing songs for 40 plus years, you know, so there's a definite relationship between other people's songwriting and poetry. Mine, you know, I threatened people to say, now that I'm poet laureate, I'm just going to recite a bunch of Laser Wolves and American Falcon lyrics, because those are the only things I have memorized. So there's definitely a relationship to that. But when it comes to poetry, you know, I was writing those one sentence, that practice, without thinking about them as poems until I read Braided Creek, which is Jim Harrison and Ted Kooser. And what that was a series of just short little 3 to 8 line poems. There was a collection of these postcards that these two magnificent poets were sending back and forth to each other. And I thought, well, if I kind of recreate some of my sentences and add line breaks and tweak here and there, then those would become poems in the vein of what these guys were doing. And that is largely what One Sentence Journal is comprised of. And I literally never gave any thought to being a poet until people started calling me one when that book came out. And I just thought, you know, the people I admire most, you know, Joy Harjo, Jim Harrison, they write whatever they want to write, whether it's prose, poetry, articles, you name it. They just do it. And that's what I wanted to be. And I just thought it sounded cool to be a poet because it's kind of subversive. I mean, that sounds like a joke, but it is, you know. In Afghanistan, when the Taliban took power again, they started executing poets. These poets have something to say to a culture, and it's fun to joke about, yeah, you get into it because you don't want to make any money or whatever. That's true too, but I don't know, I just like it. I just like it.
I started out writing poetry. That's since I was a kid. So I've ventured into some essays and prose and short stories, but I always go back to poetry.
What is it about poetry?
I like the short succinctness of it. To me, it's more immediately emotive. And that's usually why I'm writing, because I need to, you know, run through things. And I don't have the attention span to write really long things.
Yeah.
I've got half a short story that I've been working on for a couple months now, because I just can't seem to get my attention span back to it and focus on it again. But I might in 6 months.
I hear you. And it's the freedom too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about poetry. That's why kids finally fall in love, I think, with poetry mainly, is because you finally get that idea in their head that you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, you don't get that opportunity in public school, usually, up to that
Right.
point, in the other classes, very often. I mean, I think that's changing, but it used to be that way, very in spades. But so it is that freedom and just being able to almost respond irrationally to what is an unexplainable situation. I mean, it's like, you wake up in the morning and open your eyes, what the hell is going on? And how much longer is it gonna be going on? And what the hell does it mean? I mean, these are questions that only poetry can somehow deal with in no real rational way. I mean, we can go about it in a rational way and create a story and a narrative and tell a story and write a fiction and invent something, and that's wonderful and we like it. But poetry, I think, is that reactive thing that happens, in these flashes of, and it is often in an emotional state. And so that's why I think poetry is attractive to those people who wind up either being called or calling themselves poets.
And it's ancient too. I mean, our oldest literature, Beowulf and Gilgamesh and things like that began as poems. And I like to think that if indigenous North America had been written language people, our creation stories and our old stories would have been written in a poetic form also. Like a short one is like the Ojibwe word for hello is boujou. And everybody said, well, you're just taking the French and changing it. No, it exists long before that. The first person on the earth was named Nana Boujou, and he's our trickster figure, and he does all of these things. And at some point he goes down, he decides he's gonna go to sleep. Someday Nana Boujou's gonna wake up and start fucking with the world again. So the Anishinaabe are like, well, we need to keep track and be aware of when Nana Boujou returns. So when you would meet a stranger, you would say, Gina, wana Boujou? Gina, wana Boujou? And it ultimately got shortened to Boujou. Gina means, are you wana Boujou? Are you wana Boujou? Are you wana Boujou? And it just becomes Boujou. So when we say hello, we're basically saying, are you the trickster? And I would just love to imagine that written down in some form that would exist in the way that Beowulf and Gilgamesh and all those things do, because I'm sure they would have. There was a question in the very back.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask for advice in a way. I at one point was like, I want to write nature poems, and I know you guys, that's not your thing and whatever, but this is about
It's my
poetry, but yeah. And I at one point was inspired by like Mary Oliver and your one sentence journal book and whatnot, and I'm like, I go out into nature and I'm sitting by the creek, and I've got my notepad ready, and I can write about like human condition poems all day long about crying in the bathtub or whatever, but actually trying to write about nature always seemed to just come off as anybody could have written that. And I just wondered if, you know what I mean? Like, there goes the creek, it makes this sound or whatever. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for like finding the narrative there. I don't know.
I think what you will find if you read Mary Oliver closely is she was blending together what you described you're good at with being out in nature. So a number of her poems, I mean, she had such a hard life that most people don't know of. They just think of her, people actually have the audacity to knock her for her poetry sometimes. But there's so much going on in those. I think that's what you do. You just spend the time in those places and you filter the experiences that you do know about through the experience of being on that riverbank or whatever. And you have to wade through a lot of shit to get good stuff. I didn't come up with 50 or whatever it is in one sentence journal by writing 60. I wrote for 8 years or whatever, every day almost, and then winnowed those down to however many, turned them into poems, shit canned a bunch more. It's that daily practice we were talking about. It's just doing it over and over and chipping away and figuring out how your experiences work in the context of the wider world. That's the only way you can do it.
I want to just emphasize what you
Yes.
said about that. It's that what I would consider the best nature poetry is rarely about nature itself. Anybody can talk about the burbling stream that is pretty, but it's Mary Oliver who makes you think about your own life when she writes about wild geese.
Yeah.
and like why that poem affects you so much. It's not because, yes, seeing a bunch of wild geese is gorgeous, but it's not because she's describing wild geese. It's because she's getting into the human condition and maybe crying in the bathtub, but using geese as the vehicle to do that. And to get there, yeah, just, you got to do, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think human beings are, at least I am, full of self-doubt constantly. And so, you know, I'll write something and I'll think it's just a waste of time and total garbage, and then I'll look at it again a day later and I'll see something there that it's either genius or there's something there to develop. You know what I mean? It's like you're just constantly seeing things differently. I'll read a book of poetry that I go and pick up and I'll think, it's a big deal about that. And I'll come back to it 2 months later and I'll pick it up and I'll go, oh my God, this is incredible. So it's all about just being present, bringing yourself present into the situation, and it's like the Stafford thing, right? You got to start somewhere. If you're sitting by a creek or whatever you're doing, just start describing some stuff, right? So you start describing things, and then maybe, you know, whatever you're going through, if you're going through anything or whatever's going on in your mind will find its way in, or maybe something else will rush in and change you and take you off course out of the nature line of things. And, you know, it's just the way poetry or creation works. Just trust the process. Jump in, swim, fail, drown, be revived. You know, I mean, I think that's kind of just all you have to do. I mean, if you want it, if you're really driven to do it, you're going to do it. So.
And if you get really good at describing rivers and trees and all of that stuff, it's going to make you really good at describing the bathtub and the tile and the water stains on the spout and the mold and the cracks of the floor. You know what I mean? Anything we do to practice just our observation and how to record that is going to have impact no matter what you do with it.
And sometimes you're going to say things like, wow, those flames are really flamey. And then be like, and I'm a poet.
Right.
That's such great description. But that's how you get there.
Yes?
In that process that you described of winnowing out the stuff that didn't seem to rise to the level of what you wanted, identifying the good gold nuggets, how much do any of you rely on others for feedback and helping you with that process? Or is it just a solo individual engagement in your own right?
I don't at all. I really don't. I mean, what I write, especially poetry, is for me. And like when I winnow those down, it's the ones, like every poem, whether it's a haiku or a little bit longer, is like a little short story for myself. And when I read it, it takes me back to that moment of what inspired it in the first place. And if it doesn't, that's the one that gets tossed. And then my hope is that when I get it to where I love it, chances are someone else is going to too. And I just I don't even know that I trust it. I literally don't care. I don't care if other people, what they think of it. I'm just doing it for myself, and hopefully then other people are into it, because I can second guess, like Mark said, just our insecurities and our second guessing. As soon as I show it to somebody different and I get an answer different than what I expect, that person makes my hit list, right? So it's as much for that as anything else. Like I have a book, it's not poetry, and I had people offer to read parts when I would talk about struggling with it. And, I already had the book deal, and I already had an editor for it, and I really didn't want any other input, because what he was going to say is what was going to fuel what I needed to do or not do, and any other input was just noise that was just going to freak my neurosis. And Mara might have had a perfect solution to a problem I have, but maybe that solution isn't the one the guy who ultimately publishes it thinks, and it just felt like that would just be too much extra input that I couldn't. It's hard enough as it is, even with the short stuff like Mara's saying. It's other people feel differently. I like sharing my work. I don't necessarily want it critiqued. I had a guy one time, I have a poem in One Sense Journal that's like maybe 2 pages long. Literally, I keep saying literally, but it is about my yard. Driving up and seeing my yard and how it compares to everybody else's in the neighborhood and how much of a mess it is. But, I love the pile of bird seed under the feeders and all of this. And a guy came in, I don't know if you were there, came into the bookstore hands me this manila folder. And it was a line-by-line breakdown of what my poem meant. And it was 3 single-spaced front and back page analysis of this poem. I guarantee he spent far longer on it than I did on my poem. And it was weird to see my work filtered through the different ideas of what it could have meant if I thought that much about it. And I was, no, this is my messy yard and the task list I see when I look at it, and I would rather be watching the birds. And it's just how you approach things.
I do both. Of course, I think any poet that's like when we were working on this collection, I went through and winnowed it down to a certain set of poems that I really wanted in there, or that I felt should go in there. And I did have my friend Ana Maria Espana read through it and was helping me organizationally and a little bit editorially, like not heavy critique like line by line, but making suggestions about certain things. And she did help me quite a bit with that. So I like a little bit of input, but when you're really just picking what you like and what you're winnowing out, what you're not going to show to other people. You read it and you go, no, nobody else needs to see that one. You don't need to read through my journal and what the original looked like or anything like that. But I like a little bit of help. And then what I asked for a lot of help with on the book was organizational, like how to order the poems. Does this one actually fit in with these other ones that I'm trying to squeeze it in with? And that changed a few things from other people.
Yeah, I kind of agree with both of those two things in a way. I don't think I ever really, graduate school, any of you that's ever been involved in that process, you don't necessarily seek out the advice of these people. They're in the same classroom as you, and they get your poem, and some of them are just love to just murder your poem and help you make it better. But they're basically making it into their poem, and I understand that. I mean, what else can we do if we try to really line by line edit someone else's poem? We're going to make it our poem. So I learned there in that situation. I guess I learned who to listen to, who I wanted to listen to, who really kind of got what I was doing, and then when I listened to them, I also listened to them with a cautious sort of ear. Some of their comments improved the poem, and some of them were obvious as soon as they said it, or like you would say to them, I'm not sure about this area, and it's like, yeah, they said, yeah, you're right, that's the area. And so then you go back and you mess with that whole section again because it's not working right. Those kinds of comments I thought were really valuable. But then, early on, I let some people who I respected sort of influence me to change lines in poems. I'll be goddamned. I'll pick up that book now, years later, and I'll go and I'll read that poem, and I'll get to that one spot, and I'll recognize that line, and it just, it's just one of the things that I'm fascinated with in my own excursion in writing poems is sound. And I just like that kind of soundy thing going on. Sometimes somebody else will have a great suggestion, but the sound, the rhythm, it's not there. It's like, it's not working. And so, I mean, now I regret that I let that, I can go back and change it. I have one friend that keeps changing stuff that's been in print for years, just keeps, I'm going to rewrite that poem. But at some point you have to let everything go into the past, I think. And I don't do as much calling on other people for advice these days as I did years ago, I guess. But I still like to hear from somebody if they have something to tell me. It's like, maybe you should listen to that. If it's not quite working for them, then it's probably not working for others.
I was on a panel at the Jackson Hole Writers Conference this past spring, and there was a guy there, a poet, I can't remember his name now, but he was talking about his whole career as a poet. He was always sending his work to one of his former instructors. And now he's at this point in his life, it was like this existential moment where like, I have to stop doing that because I realize I've been writing to his preferences and not my own. And, we do, mentors are important, I think, but you do reach a point where you have to kind of branch away and kind of make your own mistakes and all of that.
What's your attitude towards mixing humorous poetry and serious poetry
In the same what?
in the same volume? What's your attitude on mixing humorous poetry and quote serious poetry in the same book?
I'll quote Michael Earl Craig on this one. You should leapfrog him.
Yeah.
No, I put words in his mouth, but he, he writes a lot of humorous sort of stuff, and a lot of times it'll be, it'll interrupt the more serious the things that aren't so humorous, and I like that. Mm-hmm. I like variety. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
personally.
Goes the same with like talking about what's a nature poem. Like, I don't know. I think that's life. Life is funny. Life is serious. I don't know. I mean, unless it's, I guess the only thing I would say about that is sometimes it could be too jarring to the reader. You'd want to, it's like putting a folk song up against like some heavy metal sometimes.
And I think it depends on the reader, probably.
But yeah, and it does depend on the reader.
It depends on the reader.
Finding that flow.
I got a KISS t-shirt on, man. I got to represent.
But you know what I mean. Like if you have that sudden shift, it can take you out of your enjoyment of the reading if it's too much or whatever. And I mean, that's one thing that like a good editor who's going through and helping you, like when I said I needed help ordering things. But like I think they should be combined. Yeah.
I mean, Earl Craig there's not a lot of Earl Craigs for one thing, but I don't think I've ever set out to write a humorous poem, though there's humor in the things that I write. Mm-hmm. And I think I would fail utterly if I tried to sit down and write a humorous poem, but I agree with both of you. It's a matter of sequencing, which is what you talked about it wonderfully, putting this together. I remember those days, and it was a hair-pulling experience. I took the easy way out. It's okay, this one's got snow in it, that's in winter. This one's got rain in it, that's in spring,
We did have one question at the back there.
Yeah.
Observation, and do you find that your observational sensitivities or sensibilities are different or enhanced some way when you step out of the familiar and go into like a new geographic or cultural or social situation?
Absolutely, and I have an anecdote for that. this past summer, I talked to some students at the University of Montana in the basement of the Payne Center, which is the Native American Studies building. And it was a bunch of students from the reservation. I walked in the room and just kind of looked around, and then I'm waiting for the kids. I'm thinking, how am I going to connect to these kids? So when they came in the room, I said, okay, if you didn't know you were in the Payne Center, how would you know that you're in an Indian space now? And they were pointing out all these things that I hadn't noticed, like the patterns in the carpet or the patterns on the walls and just different things. And there were some outlandish ones. And I said, those are good, but that's not true. And I said, here's how I knew. I said, that clock there says one time, that clock there says another time, and neither one of them are right. And this whole front row of Blackfeet kids were like, Indian time! Because that's one of our tropes, is that Indian time is its own thing. And I have this practice of trying to notice things. And I guarantee 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would not have made that notice. Anyone else?
Yeah, changing your environment, it's,
It's always good.
yeah,
It's always good to see new things.
yeah. And I think changing your environment when you come back to your day-to-day environment makes you see your day-to-day environment more clearly and differently and in a different way. So it works both ways. That's why we need vacations,
Right.
and travel.
I'm seriously excited that in another month I'm going to go to Ireland.
Ooh,
Yeah.
I'm leaving the continent. Never done that before.
oh, wow.
Well, don't leave your bones behind.
Yeah.
No, my bones are coming back.
Okay,
Kicking and screaming.
right. We'll make a pact that if something happens, I'll come get you.
Make something happen, so we have to go to.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, one more?
One more?
I hear you got another book coming. It sounds like something pretty interesting. Maybe you can tell us about what's coming.
So it's not poetry, it's memoir / history / social science. I've been writing it long enough that my bio in this book presumably would already be out if I'd lived up to that. But it's called Becoming Little Shell. It's about the Little Shell Chippewa tribe, who we are, where we came from, our path from being the landless Indians for 163 years, who we are, where we come from, who the Métis are. It's a cultural group recognized in Canada, but not the United States, which we are largely comprised of. And then the story of who my family are, kind of is the narrative thread through it. And it'll be out. I just got the email from the managing editor yesterday. Who do we need to send copies to for blurbs? Blah, all that stuff. I was like, Jesus, this may actually happen. And this time next year, it should be out. I hope this time.
Me too.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
This
thanks
is
for
great.
coming.
Thank you.
Buy copies of the anthology and donate to the festival.
Yes.